Damia, you are a lawyer at the Paris Bar, and you're also counsel for the UGFP, the Union Juive France pour la Paix, which is a Jewish French NGO, as well as a Palestinian victim. And you recently filed a complaint in Paris against an Israeli NGO whose members blocked humanitarian aid into Gaza.
Blocking physically humanitarian aid from entering Gaza in groups. They organize the blockades. So basically, they call for people, they organize different convoys, they call for people to join them in different minibuses, and they identify themselves as Francophone Zionists. So most of them are actually French. So this is illegal under French law. It is genocide, and genocide is not an opinion. It's not a historical event that happened once or twice. It is a legal definition.
Hello and welcome to episode 136 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for decolonization, justice, and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram. And you can call me Mikey Intifada if you're scared to travel because you might get arrested.
Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram at the Palestine Pod. You can also find us on Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes and an additional podcast per week. It's a little more laid back. We talk politics, Palestine, pop culture, and get a little more personal. We're also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with our Patreon subscribers only. So check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. Today's guest is Damia Taharraoui, lawyer at the Paris Bar. Damia, welcome to the Palestine Pod.
Thank you so much for having me.
Damia, you are a lawyer at the Paris Bar, and you're also counsel for the UGFP, the Union Juive France pour la Paix, which is a Jewish French NGO, as well as a Palestinian victim. And you recently filed a complaint in Paris against an Israeli NGO whose members blocked the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Can you give us a little bit of background information on this case? How did it come about? What exactly did these individuals do? And why is this against the law?
Thank you for this question to kind of introduce everything. And it all started thanks to you, Lara, when you sent me this piece of evidence, which was basically a video recording of an individual in front of the border, basically, of Gaza, filming themselves blocking the road that allows humanitarian trucks to come in. This person was calling everyone online to kind of join them and basically calling everyone to help them block the humanitarian trucks coming in. And so you asked me basically, what can we do about this? It turns out that this person is French. They're quite famous because they advertise themselves as French on French media very easily. They introduce themselves as being French. And then this kind of started a little investigation on social media, which helped us kind of identify that this person wasn't alone. They were operating within two different organizations and collectives, basically, with more French people, and they identify themselves as Francophone Zionists, and so most of them are actually French. And basically these people organized, they do two separate things. They do a lot of things, but the two behaviors that we identified are, first, blocking physically the humanitarian aid from entering Gaza in groups, and secondly, they organize the blockades. So basically they call for people, they organize different convoys, they call for people to join them in different minibuses, and they just make little parties in front of the border. And so these two sets of behaviors, we qualified them as being, first, complicity to genocide in physically blocking the aid from coming in, and secondly, incitement to genocide and calling people to join them and participate in these gatherings and blockade. So this is definitely illegal under French law, because France, as many countries, codified genocide under French law. Definition is clear and easy. And so the French definition is the same one, more or less, as the one in the Rome Statute. It just adds one condition. And the definition is if one of 5 acts are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, religious group. And so you have like the 5 types of behavior. The one we identified here, I think that the 5 acts are quite evident in the situation of Gaza and Palestine, but we focused on one only here, which is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. And so the French law adds one criteria, which is all of this done within a concerted plan. So this is the added element. And we felt that this definitely, this incident definitely fell within the definition of genocide under French law.
Does it matter how much aid they were able to block? Do you have an idea of how much aid they succeeded in blocking? How long were they out there for? Did this behavior last for months? Does it even matter in terms of qualifying it as a crime under French law?
It doesn't really matter because it's the intent and the behavior that are criminalized, not the consequence. So it doesn't really matter what the actual consequences were, as long as the behavior was done, and secondly, it was done with the intent to destroy and with a concerted plan. So what we know is that it started at least in January. And we were able to document a couple of events where they blocked the entrance for a couple of days in a row. We don't know exactly the amount or the quantity of humanitarian aid that wasn't allowed or that they successfully blocked. But what we do know for sure is that when we look at the dates that they have shared information about them blocking, so pictures and videos and with their names, their full names, everything is out there very easily, very accessible. When we look at the dates of these events that they have themselves documented and the number of trucks coming in from the places that they've blocked, we can see how efficient it was. For example, in January, for 2 days, so they were blocking at the Kerem Shalom crossing. 0 trucks entered from that crossing for 2 days when they started one of their actions. So there is a direct connection between whatever action they're having and whatever action they're doing and the actual access to humanitarian aid.
So this brings up 2 things for me, I think. One is that you were able to make a very clear case because the amount of humanitarian aid trucks which enter into Gaza is a quantified number that is known, that is public, which is posted by UN sources and other NGO sources. So you're able to integrate that into the complaint. And then the other thing is just the sheer brazenness of these individuals and this organization, to the extent that they were bragging about this on social media. And it's very consistent with the behavior that we've also seen of the Israeli occupation forces as it concerns their conduct in Gaza, bragging about their crimes, posting them on social media. And this has actually led to the accumulation of thousands of photos and videos. A number of people and individuals are working on trying to secure accountability in those cases against the soldiers. The Hind Rajab Foundation, for example, that's just one NGO, has identified over 1,000 Israeli soldiers that have committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and participated in genocidal acts, and have made submissions to relevant courts, one of them being the ICC, calling for arrest warrants to be issued for them as well, but also in France. So if I can just share one recent update in that respect, because I think it's also very relevant to the case that you filed. We learned that the Hind Rajab Foundation just filed an urgent legal complaint in France against an individual named Roy Hakimi, an Israeli soldier who was implicated in acts of torture and enforced disappearance of Palestinians during his time participating in the genocide. And he's currently on a tourism visit in France. There were photos of him posted on social media on a ski trip, I believe. And so the Hind Rajab Foundation activated really quickly to file an urgent complaint because now the French courts do have jurisdiction over that behavior, given that he is physically located in France. So that falls under French jurisdiction. They describe how they have photos of him with Palestinian detainees who are bound and stripped to their undergarments, standing in freezing temperatures amid the ruins of Gaza at night. And that this confirms that he's participated in grave violations of international law during Israel's military offensive, and that he posted these photos to his own social media. It just really highlights that whether in the case of the case that you filed for the blocking of humanitarian aid, or as it concerns Israeli soldiers' conduct, they're making it very easy for these cases to be brought. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that. What do you think this is? I mean, we know that Israel has now started to advise the soldiers to take down photos, take down videos, but it's been 14 months of this behavior. And only now they're starting to realize that this is against the law and that they will be pursued wherever they go, because this is illegal everywhere.
The occupation army has also issued warning about traveling to certain countries, and has told its occupation soldiers to come back basically from those countries because they are at risk of being prosecuted. I was going to touch on the brazenness as well. They're just uploading these war crimes with their full chest. Why do you think that they are so brazen? And don't you miss a time when war criminals were discreet?
So I think this is just a result of a huge feeling of impunity that is enabled by global society. Everything, the system, everything allows them to feel that they're invincible and that whatever they're doing, they're never going to be held accountable for it. So I think this is why they're sharing everything so easily. And well, I guess as a criminal lawyer, or here defending victims, I don't think we miss a time where criminals were more discreet, because this makes our job very easy. Very easy. It's just like snooping around Instagram, Facebook, and everything else. It has a fancy name. It's called open source investigation, and people do like get trainings for that. And so here, we didn't even need to do like all the fancy and technical like research things to find evidence. It was just looking at their Facebook timeline and screenshotting everything. And since we filed, we went back to see, like, to some of the profiles. And I have to say that some of them have gone private. Not all of them. Some of them have gone private. And we were looking at them quite regularly since we filed, because we were expecting them to react to the filing somehow. And they didn't, which I guess is, I don't know if it's good or bad, but they didn't. And they just shared more elements and more like wording that allows us to prove their intent. So this is, we're just like continuing to monitor all of this, and we will send this to the judges regularly to kind of feed the investigation.
Yeah, on the point about intent, it's very interesting because a lot of the Facebook posts, the social media posts, I mean, I've seen many of them, and a lot of them are very proud of the behavior. They're calling it moral. They're saying that it's morally justified. They're saying it's legally justified. Of course, that's not true. And there are lawyers that are part of this organization, so that's quite shocking to hear lawyers make that as an assessment. But they are not only putting it out there for the world to see, but insisting that it's the morally correct thing to do. And that very much aligns with a lot of the genocidal intent that you saw coming out of Israeli leaders since October 2023, where they would say things like, there's no civilians in Gaza. Everyone is guilty in Gaza. There's no innocence there. Even the children are guilty. And you would hear on some Israeli media how they would debate, is a Palestinian toddler guilty? Oh, well, maybe not a toddler, but anyone above the age of 5. I mean, these are some of the conversations that you would hear in the public discourse in Israeli media.
And that was the progressive left over there.
As you say, it makes your job as a lawyer very easy because you have the criminal code, you have these elements that must be satisfied, and it's all provided there for you. You see the acts, you see the intent, and you see the consequences, which, as you say, you don't even need to prove, but you have it in addition. So it seems like you have sort of a slam dunk case that should clearly be successful. You should clearly be able to prevail in theory. Do you have a sense that if I can ask you this, I mean, what's your feeling about how the case is going to be received? Because in France, we're also operating in a very particular political climate. So when the ICC arrest warrants were issued for Netanyahu and Gallant, there was some mixed messaging which came out of France. There was the suggestion that France would honor its obligations under the Rome Statute and that they would be required to arrest Netanyahu or Gallant if they ever arrived in France. But then President Macron also came out and said, well, we're assessing this because of immunity. Now, you and I both know that that argument doesn't work with respect to the Rome Statute and immunity for crimes against humanity and war crimes, which is what they're being accused of before the ICC. So do you think, one, that's going to have any impact on how this is received before the courts, or are you confident that the courts are going to be able to look at this and apply the law correctly and not be affected by the political atmosphere? And then two, I'm also just curious about what you think is the reason why Macron is sending this mixed messaging when the law is very clear that that argument just doesn't work.
So I think when the Minister of Foreign Affairs came out with this statement last week, which was weirdly enough the same day that we filed, it's obviously just a coincidence, but so since then, legal scholars in France and legal professionals have criticized. Heavy criticism has been published and on the French statement regarding immunities. So I don't think, or maybe it's just being too hopeful, but I don't think this will impact the way our complaint is received by judges. Also because we're targeting individuals. So we're not targeting high-profile politicians or people who are involved in government somehow. So this might make it easier. And also we're targeting French citizens. So France has a duty to prosecute its citizens when its citizens do commit crimes and do violate French law. So this is slightly different. This is why I think maybe I'm being too hopeful that the statement regarding the immunities will not impact the case. However, so because the case we're making is a complicity case, it requires the judges to identify and to recognize that the main act, which is genocide, is being committed. And I don't know. I'm hoping for a good surprise, but I don't think French judges will be the first to identify whatever is happening as a genocide. And this is the crucial step for them to continue under complicity. But what will happen for sure is that whatever we're bringing is criminal behavior. They might requalify. They might say, okay, this is not really complicity genocide, but it might amount to a war crime, or it might amount to another kind of crime against humanity. But we specifically filed this complaint only under genocide. We did not say this could also be another form of crime. And this was a point made to refuse to wash down the gravity of what is happening. It is extremely serious. It is genocide, and genocide is not an opinion. It's not a historical event that happened once or twice. It is a legal definition. And if this wasn't genocide, well, then change the criminal code. And we'll call it whatever name you give it in the criminal code. But this is the one you chose. So this is the one we're using. And it's the one that victims are using. It's the one that Palestinian scholars are using. It's the one that is identified by a lot of authorities who are looking at the situation objectively. And this is why it's the word we're choosing to qualify the situation.
Yeah, if the French judges don't want to call it genocide, they would be at odds with over 800 genocide scholars and 50 scholars of the Holocaust. Wasn't it the guy who wrote the textbook on genocide said that this is a textbook genocide? Like, are French judges going to be like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, Michael brings up a great point here. I mean, going back even to October 2023, you had people like Professor Ross Siegel, an Israeli anti-Zionist, Holocaust scholar calling this a textbook case of genocide. And since then, you've had so many more scholars of Holocaust studies and genocide also come out and confirm the same. The most recent confirmation of this came from Amnesty International, which published their nearly 300-page report finding that Israel's conduct constitutes genocide in Gaza. That came after you had 2 UN reports by the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, who authored a report called Anatomy of a Genocide, followed by another report called Genocide as Colonial Erasure. And then you had the Commission of Inquiry from the UN as well that also confirmed that Israel was carrying out genocidal acts. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on, and I'm actually keeping a running list of everybody who has qualified this as genocide. But the evidence is just mounting, and the relevant, stakeholders are agreeing and agreeing and agreeing. And what you see is the only people that are contesting that this is a genocide are the ones that have an interest in maintaining the destruction of Gaza. So it's Israel and Israel apologists, and also the United States, who continues, whose officials and representatives continue to be questioned at press conferences and continue to say, well, we just don't agree. And they'll never actually debate the issue on the merits and discuss the substance of these reports. They'll just deny that this constitutes genocide and move on. So, but anybody who's actually going to do the analysis on the merits has concluded that it's genocide. They have come to a clear consensus. So I think that it was right for you to file only on genocide. But I also want to make another point, which is that incitement to genocide, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think I'm right when I say that incitement to genocide doesn't actually require them to find that genocide has occurred. You can incite someone to genocide before genocide has taken place. So the court may also find that incitement has taken place, in addition to complicity with war crimes, for example. And that's still criminal conduct, which is still going to be prosecuted.
At this point, if you printed out all of the reports, you could build a house with them that the Israelis would also try to steal.
Or demolish, right?
Yeah. And really quickly, I just want to make the point, like, what you're doing is kind of in stark contrast to what the ICC is doing, where they're going top down. You guys are trying to go bottom up. Like, you are putting the focus on the field operatives, the people who literally went out into the field to commit genocide. And I think that's super important because, culpability, sure, like the buck stops with the top, but it starts with the bottom. Like, you have to address the base of people who were orchestrating and executing a genocide literally with their own hands, and not just talk about the person who's up top giving all of the orders. That seems like a very clear understanding of addressing the issue, but most people are trying to reduce it to what like the ICC case is covering, which is just a couple politicians.
It's a really important point. Francesca Albanese always says international law starts at home. And what she's speaking about is cases like this that operate under the principle of universal jurisdiction. So maybe for some of the listeners who don't know what that means, can you just give us a little bit more background on universal jurisdiction more broadly, and what it would mean for lawyers all around the globe to really leverage that to seek accountability for the genocide in Gaza?
So universal jurisdiction is a principle that allows national or domestic courts to have jurisdiction on the most severe crimes, which are international crimes, so genocide, torture, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, to have jurisdiction on these crimes, even if the author or the perpetrator and the victims are not of the nationality or citizenship of the country of jurisdiction, basically. And it's an extremely important principle. It's extremely powerful because it allows to kind of take a situation out of its context to prosecute it, basically, because we know whatever is happening now in Gaza and in Palestine, the people who are committing it are Israeli and are under Israeli jurisdiction. Israel is never going to prosecute them for genocide because it means that they're going to, well, admit their own guilt. This is never going to happen. And because it's not possible, or it's extremely difficult to envision or think about a world where this would happen, well, this principle was created to kind of allow prosecution to happen and accountability to happen elsewhere. So it's a very powerful tool, but it also has its limits, because then there is the question of legitimacy. Why does a foreign country, and it's most often a European country or a country from the global north, who may have jurisdiction on something that happened elsewhere. So it does have its limits. So we always have to think about legitimacy whenever we're using this powerful tool of universal jurisdiction. And here, specifically in this case, which was quite interesting, is that we didn't go for universal jurisdiction. We went for something else, which is extraterritorial jurisdiction. So France creates jurisdiction of its own courts for two situations. I mean, for several, but here we used two, which is basically if a French citizen or French national commits severe crimes outside of France, they might be prosecuted in France. First. Secondly, if a French victim is, well, victim of a crime outside of France, they're allowed to file a complaint in France. So here, not only the people we have identified are French, so it allows us to attack them this way, but also we are filing not only on behalf of an organization that is a Jewish anti-Zionist organization, but also for a French Palestinian victim whose entire family is in Gaza right now and are not able to exit. And so she's also a direct victim. So we're arguing that she is also individually and personally suffering from the genocide and the complicity to genocide. So she has grounds to basically file a complaint.
You said that a French citizen can be tried for crimes outside of France. Senegal would like a word. Okay, thank you so much.
And thank you for clarifying the difference between extraterritorial jurisdiction and universal jurisdiction. If you brought the case on the basis of universal jurisdiction, it would have meant that the victims were not French and that the author was not necessarily French, but that the crime is egregious. And so you ask a French court to look at it, which is, I believe, the basis for there was a complaint also filed recently against Smotrich in France. And I think that was filed on the basis of universal jurisdiction. And he was supposed to come to France, actually, for a conference. I think it was one of those settlement conferences. And this was filed days before he was supposed to arrive. And I believe he never came. But then I think he ended up denying that it was related to the complaint which was filed, which, of course, that's what they're all going to say, right? They're not going to say, I'm terrified to travel because I don't want to be arrested. But if you look at some of the posts that they made, Michael, they would say things like, today we blocked X amount of trucks. Like, they would give a direct assessment of the ways in which they were complicit. This goes back to last year. Remember when we were reporting on how Zionists were standing at the crossing and they were having like these techno dance parties and they were dancing and they were showing up with their families and they were blocking the aid? Like, this is part of that.
Yeah, they distributed tents as well so that people could stay overnight. Like, there was an industrial delivery of tents, probably like 100 or so, that was just passed out. And so this was clearly like a well-funded, well-organized effort to block aid during a genocide, during forced starvation of the Palestinian people.
And I think now is probably a good time to remind that the situation hasn't improved in terms of humanitarian aid. Actually, today, 14 months in, it's probably the worst that it's been since the beginning of the genocide. There has been a massive, massive siege on the northern part of Gaza where no trucks have entered for weeks now. And Israel continues to fire on and kill humanitarian aid workers, including internationals. You have UNRWA reporting, for example, that last month, 90% of aid trucks were looted at the Karam Abu Salim crossing. As of December 1st, UNRWA paused the delivery of aid through Karam Abu Salim due to a total breakdown of law and order. It's gotten to the point where people are so starved that even the delivery of aid is impossible because there's just a total breakdown of society, which of course is exactly what Israel wanted and is exactly what they were aiming to do when they announced a total siege on Gaza and when they blocked humanitarian aid for 14 months straight in violation of all of these legal rulings, the ICJ's rulings, and also now you have the arrest warrants that are issued. So it's a very, very, very grave situation. You also have, I think it was Norway that recently went to the ICJ for an additional ruling on Israel's obligation to provide humanitarian aid in response to Israel's attacks on UNRWA. And it seems like all we are doing is seeking more and more and more rulings to tell us what we already know, and that isn't having enough of an impact. But I do think that there is value in everything all at once and bringing as many of these cases as we can all over the world, because there is no statute of limitations on war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. And if it takes the next 100 years, then we will continue to pursue these actions and try to hold those perpetrators accountable for their international crimes. There was one attempt in French courts where individuals brought a case against a French soldier who participated in acts of torture and who uploaded a video of himself unloading a Palestinian detainee out of a truck and saying, look at his back, you can see how he's been injured. And lawyers took that case to court, but the judges threw it out, saying that there wasn't enough evidence and that it was inconclusive.
So that case was filed the standard way, which is filing a complaint before the prosecutor's office. And then the prosecutor's office is allowed to look at it, open an investigation, continue, or close it down because of different reasons. And here it was closed down because there isn't enough evidence. So it was a very interesting case. And I don't know exactly where it is at now, but there are ways of appealing the rejection of the prosecutor. However, what we tried to take from this case, because it was filed early on this year, was that we cannot have faith in the prosecutor's office for this matter. So we used a specific provision within French law, which allows us to kind of go around and really just file directly before an investigative judge and not go the normal route, which is prosecutor's office. Once they believe that there is enough evidence, then they can go before an investigative judge. And once the investigative judge believes there is enough evidence, then we can go for trial. What we tried to do, and this is provided for in the Code of Criminal Procedure, specifically for the most serious crimes, is that we just go directly before a judge. So this is what we try to do. And it allows us to at least guarantee under specific conditions, which is that we're not talking about something completely inexistent or something crazy, which isn't so that the facts actually did happen. The investigative judge is obliged to open an investigation and try to investigate before saying that there isn't enough evidence or that it's not possible to, go further because they can't find who is responsible for the actions. But we know that at least now an investigation will for sure be opened. And if they try to block it somehow, we'll have ways of appealing this. But this is basically what we try to at least take out of this case. But I hope they appealed because there was a lot of evidence.
I think this is great, and this highlights the importance of being a savvy lawyer that understands procedural rules, right? If you understand procedural rules, you will be a much better lawyer than someone who just understands substance and merits but can't articulate a strategy of a case. So I think that's really good for people to learn from. Two things that this brings up. One, what do perpetrators risk if they're found guilty of complicity in genocide or incitement to genocide? What's at stake here? And two, is there any precedent for holding individuals accountable in France for atrocity crimes that were committed outside of France? And what happened in those cases?
So what's at stake is a very, very, very long sentence, prison sentence, basically. And so in France, there is a special unit within the prosecutor's office and a special unit of judges who are in charge of the most serious crimes and specifically international crimes. So, and they have been studying and working and investigating only international crimes. So France has a lot of experience on this. Unfortunately, judges are understaffed. They're extremely understaffed. They don't have enough resources to investigate. They have the jurisdictions, but they just don't have enough means. And this is a real problem that the French justice system is facing. And so judges have experience, and the French system has prosecuted this kind of crimes, particularly in relation to Syria, but under genocide, particularly in the context of Rwanda. So a lot of investigations have been ongoing. A few convictions have happened in the past couple of years, particularly under Complicity genocide. And it's quite interesting for us because there isn't a lot of jurisprudence in France for genocide specifically. And it was quite interesting, the parallel with what happened in Rwanda with the Radio de Mille Collines, which is this radio broadcast in Rwanda that happened, so this radio broadcast called people to kind of basically kill their neighbors, and it was broadcasted everywhere, and people who were involved in this radio show and were prosecuted for complicity to genocide, and I think also incitement to genocide. And we used this in our analysis to kind of draw parallels, because it's basically the same things that they're doing, but using Facebook. And the wording is slightly different, but similar.
We have that in the United States too. It's called Fox News and MSNBC.
Radio Rwanda, they were prosecuted in France?
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting to know, because we spoke about this before on the show, talking about the potential for complicity claims to be brought against media organizations. In this case, it's the individuals using the media who are being targeted, but it also implicates the media organizations themselves, which is something to be aware of, as Michael just reminded us.
Put Haaretz on the chopping block. Okay, did that joke bomb, or are you guys frozen? What's going on?
I think I froze. I didn't hear the whole joke.
Oh, I said put Haaretz on the chopping block.
Actually, no, because the Israeli government has cut ties with them. So they're
okay. Put the Times of Israel on the chopping block. Wow, it feels like I'm doing Zoom comedy again. Thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, very long prison sentence is what you said. You also mentioned how they made their social media accounts private after you filed the complaint. Is that going to do anything? Does that matter?
I mean, we have recorded and saved the evidence, so it's already out there. I mean, it's already communicated to the judges. I don't know. Maybe so. Not all of them have put them in private. Only some of them. I don't know, I have to admit, but I think that for some of the ones who put their profiles in private, maybe, I mean, we're just not going to have new evidence regarding them. But also, I mean, judges have means to kind of like have access to information directly from Meta, or directly from X, or directly from different organizations or social media companies. So this actually might not be a problem at all.
What's private for you is not private for the security state and the police apparatus. Like, they have access to all types of information, and that's why people should be using VPNs. Can I say that, or is that like directing people to break the law in France? I don't know. Okay, you're muted. Your legal advice is best administered when you're off mute.
We're not trying to help people who are blocking humanitarian aid do it better.
Well, no, I'm talking about as an activist. Obviously, I'm not giving tips to the fucking
I know,
Zionists.
but the question was, is this going to do anything for them? Is that going to
Right.
protect them? And then you were like, use a VPN. So it just
Okay, I think people can probably connect the dots that I didn't mean for them, but
Yeah.
if I need to spell it out for people,
No, that's okay. I think
I'm
we're
not
good.
advising the Israelis on how to be more efficient at just like blocking aid.
Yeah.
I'm talking about protecting yourself as somebody who opposes
Yes.
state surveillance and state crimes.
Yes, it's important. One day I will learn how to use a VPN. Michael's always like, use a VPN. I'm like, I don't know what that means. So,
And then you're like, let's talk about culpability online. Like, what do you
As somebody who's paying attention to the discourse in France, because I admit I tend to tap out of it, it's already a lot to listen to what's happening in the English-speaking world. And the French discourse can be sometimes actually even worse than what you hear in the English-speaking world. So as someone who pays attention to that, what do you think is sort of the biggest misunderstanding in the public discourse about Gaza, or even about the Palestinian struggle more broadly? You know, when you're just thinking back on the last 14 months of public commentary, what's something that you'd like to clarify or to speak on?
So as you said, the French-speaking world can be much more ignorant about the Palestinian cause, and it can be quite blatant in public media also. I mean, there is so much that is needed. Just more historical context. Like, there is a huge lack and misunderstanding of the historical context of whatever is happening, and also, and this is also what we tried to do in bringing this complaint, is the appropriate qualifications of whatever is happening, like just the wording of what's happening there. People are so scared, and it is something that we have tried to do, is push it forward in public debate, like bring it up, just have people try to contradict the legal arguments of it being a genocide. And in France, I think it's quite interesting to kind of see the way this specific word has been received. There are a lot of op-eds and articles that have been written to kind of discredit and criticize the word and the label of genocide. And recently, I have to admit that, well, since Amnesty came with their report, a lot of support from different law professors, legal scholars who have published a very clear op-ed asking for the analysis of the situation under the label of genocide. We have had, well, French politicians coming out to support, critique, and to support the analysis of the situation as being a genocide. And, well, organizations like UGFP, who we're representing in this case, who are coming out and saying and speaking out loud and saying that whatever is happening is a genocide, and that they do not want their names and their religion to be used as a pretext for an actual genocide. So I think this is very much lacking in the French public discourse, on top of historical context, on top of just a lot of precaution of vocabulary, a lot of precaution in the way the situation is explained, and finding refuge behind the fact that it's complicated, that it's impossible to understand, that to have an informed opinion, you would need to study the situation for 25,000 years. And then even after that, you would not have enough background and clarity to understand this extremely complicated and religious conflict. This is the discourse. This is things that we would hear. When in reality, one, it's not religious. Two, history is quite simple. And it's just, I hope the French public discourse will evolve in that way.
I feel like it's extremely difficult to be pro-Palestine and outspoken in France.
It is very difficult. It is very difficult because we can see the repression of just the student movement that is particularly harsh in France, in different schools, particularly in Sciences Po. It's a political science school, and this school has been very harsh on its students. A lot of disciplinary measures have been taken. They have filed criminal complaints against their students for incitement of hatred, for just events that happened at the school, like basically being part of the Palestinian movement, pro-Palestinian movement in the school. So yeah, it's quite difficult. The use of force and the use of police custody has been used quite regularly to basically stop the movement. Whenever there would be a huge protest or a gathering, and people would be arrested. So like criminal law has been used as a tool of administrative law, basically using criminal law to stop the movement. And this is on top of like public discourse or just like speech that is criminalized under anti-terror legislation, which is extremely problematic.
Yeah, and there was just an organizer in Nice who was sentenced for similar charges.
A lot of organizers, not only in Nice, one in Montpellier recently, another union representative in Lille. A lot. It's not a single event, and when it's not actual convictions, then it's just opening investigations, calling people in for interrogations, and then just keeping the investigation open to kind of scare people off. Like, just have them not speak up again at all. And they've used this anti-terror legislation against politicians and opposition leaders, and it's very difficult not to see it as a political tool.
I think the crazy thing about this phenomenon of using anti-terror legislation to criminalize speech is that it comes against a backdrop of a legislative framework which places obligations on individuals, on states, on everybody to take steps to prevent genocide. People have to do what they can commensurate with their power over the situation. So, for example, a state that's providing weapons to Israel, the United States, for example, which provided 70% of the weaponry to Israel that it needed to carry out the slaughter and destruction of Gaza for the last 14 months, is legally complicit in that genocide, and it has an obligation to stop providing those weapons. But as ordinary citizens who are trying to use their voice to stop this atrocity, not only should they not be punished for it criminally, but they should be celebrated for abiding by their legal obligation to witness a genocide in progress and to take steps with their voice to try to stop it. And that's the crazy thing, is that you have these two legal frameworks that are operating in tandem with one another. One is the International Atrocity Crimes Framework, which is also adopted into domestic law. But then the other is this domestic anti-terrorism framework, which is used as a tool politically by governments to repress those movements that they are not interested in, having their voice heard. And it's very, very, very scary, especially in a place like France, which, historically has always called itself the country of human rights, the pays des droits de l'homme, right? That's how they brand themselves. Nobody called them that. They're the ones who decided to give themselves that label, right? So if you give yourself that label, one would think that you would try to take steps to actually abide by the label.
Giving yourself a nickname is loserish behavior.
Yeah. But they did, and they chose country of human rights, right? So it's very troubling. And I want to go back to what you said earlier, which is, what do you wish people knew in France? And you said historical context. Some of the people who have been targeted by this anti-terrorism legislation, who have been pursued as criminals, whether through the opening of a criminal investigation, calling them in for interrogation, or pursuing charges against them, did something as simple as try to provide historical context to what we're witnessing. And even that was considered criminal behavior by France. And that's the scary thing. They approached anybody who tried to provide historical context to the Palestinian struggle as somebody who they say was celebrating, the October 7th attack, which of course is simply not true. That's not, the fact that they would make that connection, that link, just shows how far they're willing to go to ensure that people do not understand what Palestinians have gone through for the last 76 years, lest they possibly develop some sympathy for Palestinians. And we wouldn't want that to happen. So we have to make sure that people just simply don't understand what's happening, right? And it reminds me of Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, when he said in the aftermath of October 7th that this didn't arise, from a vacuum. And what did Israel do? They put him on the persona non grata list. He's banned forever from entering the country. And, they've got a vendetta out against him. And they referred to the UN as a swamp of anti-Semitic bile at the General Assembly. That's what Netanyahu said a few months ago. So it's very disheartening to see that level of repression. But one thing that always comforts me is that I understand that historically speaking, when you see that level of state repression against a movement, in hindsight, the historical record will always correct that and show that the state was wrong and that the movement was right. There's never been a situation where a movement for human rights has been repressed and then the historical record says yeah, and that's what should have happened, right? There's always a way of correcting these things in the future, and that gives me some solace. Of course it doesn't help in the in this moment stopping what we're seeing and the suffering and the loss and the pain and the agony for Palestinians in Gaza, but it does provide some sort of perspective about at least what we can expect in the future, which is that we will all be vindicated. Everybody here who took a risk by speaking up, by using their voice, by using their skills to try to stop a genocide, will all be vindicated. And it's just a matter of time. And slowly but surely, they are going to start realizing that and backtracking on their previous positions.
French law is like, if you organized a protest or acted in your profession as a professor, jail time. Have you committed war crimes and genocide? Well, the laws are subjective.
That is unfortunately quite accurate. And it's quite crazy in the French context, because historical figures of resistance are extremely celebrated. The idea of someone not respecting the law because they're abiding by a higher moral, higher values, is extremely celebrated. France gives street names to these people to celebrate them.
Robespierre would hate everything that's happening right now.
Yeah. It's quite shocking whatever is happening to the Palestinian movement in France. And so with my colleague, we've been working on this for quite some time, and something that is completely not legal, but something that we have been saying quite a lot, is we cannot wait for everyone to just feel shame. Just feel shame for everything they've been saying for the past year or even more. Just feel shame to not have been able to recognize what's happening, to not have been able to say this is wrong. Filed complaints for people who have had the courage to speak the truth, to have put their names and livelihoods on the line for this. And I think introducing strategic litigation like this under international criminal law, unfortunately, it's too late. It's too late to use this as a tool to stop the genocide, to prevent it. It's happened. It has happened. It's too late to prevent it. It's impossible to repair it. Impossible. The victims have already suffered. There is no way that anything or anyone or any justice or decision could repair the harm that has been done. Its virtue is also, in introducing this kind of strategic litigation, is also to help us write history, because it cannot repair, it cannot prevent, at least it can write history. When we'll have decisions, just going through all the events, going through all the evidence, and naming things and just dating the events, this is a tool that will help us to write history and say in, well, hopefully 1 year, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 20, 30, 100 years, that this has happened, and all of Europe, all of the West, most of the world has been silent and let it happen. And it's only when we're creating situations and events where justice is allowed to say a word and say something, that we use the justice system to basically write history.
Damia, thank you so much for coming on the Palestine Pod. It was such an insightful episode, and we so appreciate all the work that you're doing. Keep up the good efforts.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you so much for creating the space to have these very important conversations, and just to keep the record straight.
Folks, that has been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Check out our full episodes and sources at www.palestinepod.com. Follow us on Instagram at @thepalestinepod, and send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. Please consider supporting the project on Patreon, www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of The Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have as good a day as you can.
We can start telling people to join the Patreon. The show wouldn't be possible without a Patreon. You got to get on our Patreon. Support us on Patreon. You can, because like I've been watching all these other podcasts and they just keep plugging Patreon like all the time.
Yeah, I'm going to clip what you just did right now.
Okay.